Steinway said, "We think your men need music. They need pianos."
A lot of these pianos were shipped on the Flying Fortresses, and then they were parachuted over enemy lines and dropped down.
Music was such an important part of the war effort that if people were coming together, you must be able to sing our Star-Spangled Banner.
The idea was it would boost morale. They're sitting around a piano in a field somewhere in Europe. Their rifles leaning against the piano. They're smoking cigarettes. They have their helmets on, and they're genuinely looking happy.
Music making, especially, is an important way to tell our story and to lift our spirits and to be in community.
A Steinway piano on a bombed-out battlefield surrounded by smiling American servicemen. It's a stark contrast to the images we think of when it comes to World War II, but this happened across Europe and the Pacific. When the guns fell silent, music would fill the air. This is the secret history of the Victory Vertical. 1942. America was at war with Nazi Germany in Europe and the Japanese in the Pacific. As young men were sent to the battlefield, the demand for raw materials skyrocketed at home, and American industry changed. Steinway Piano in New York City was no exception.
They were abruptly told to stop producing pianos.
Like any factory in the US at that time, everything was going toward the war effort.
The whole country needed to gear up for war, and so all industry was pretty much at least evaluated to whether it could be used better toward the war effort. Restricted metals included nickel, iron, copper, brass.
Raw materials that were in Steinway's pianos. But like they say in the music industry, the show must go on. So Theodore Steinway figured out a way to keep making money while still supporting America.
Steinway was involved in making gliders for troop transport and caskets.
Our president at the time, Theodore Steinway, 4 of his sons were actually in the military, and we had dozens and dozens of our craftsmen actually enlisted in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines.
With such close ties to the war, Mr. Steinway cared deeply about the men serving overseas. Although gliders and caskets were what the government needed, Steinway was still a piano man at heart. He knew his brand had a place in the war. That's when he got an idea and went to the Department of Defense.
Steinway came up with a pitch, and they took it to the Pentagon and said, "We think your men need music. They need pianos, and we think we could build a special piano that could be delivered to them wherever they are and would provide a morale boost, a connection to home, and music, which was considered a very important part, actually, of the war effort." The first response was, yes, we need pianos, but we don't need Steinway pianos.
Steinway pianos were considered some of the best in the world, and their price tag reflected that.
So Mr. Steinway said, "What kind of socks do you provide for your soldiers?" And they were very proud to say, "Only the very best socks for our soldiers." And the response from Steinway was, "Well, then give them the best pianos you can provide too."
The idea was that by providing these pianos and music to soldiers on the front lines, it would boost morale and give them a sense of feeling home again, being around the piano, really lifting their spirits.
There were 455 pianos ordered. This was a labor of love, by all means.
But why send the troops pianos? While they could bring feelings of home and comfort, let's face it, they are big and challenging to deliver to someone's house, much less a battlefield.
The piano was ubiquitous in the first half of the 20th century in the United States. They were everywhere, and they were used for everything from silent movies to churches and on Tin Pan Alley. If you're going to deliver an instrument to troops, especially troops at the front line, there are easier instruments. You could drop harmonicas or ukuleles or fiddles, but pianos were synonymous with music. It was truly class neutral, race neutral, style neutral.
But it was still too tall, too heavy, and could break easily. They needed a redesign. Those working in this Queens, New York Steinway factory, which still stands today, came up with an ingenious plan.
They knew pianos inside and out, and they knew what they needed to do.
This is one of the original buildings that would have been built in the early 1870s. So quite an old building, a lot of history, a lot of pianos have been built in these spaces. So when these were being built, part of the process would have been happening in this very building.
The piano could weigh only 455 pounds, so that it could easily be moved by 3, maybe 4 soldiers. It had to have handles for moving. There were many things about pianos that would not survive the climate that these pianos are going to live in. For instance, in the humid conditions of the South Pacific, ivory keys would just pop right off. So they had to develop a kind of celluloid with special glues that would be resistant to hyperhumidity. They had to use special pest repellent materials to avoid the pianos being destroyed by insects or by rodents.
We also did not have any copper for the bass strings. We had to use a softer steel.
Giving a good sound, but a different sound. A little bit of a brassy bass sound.
They were still built by the Steinway craftspeople, using the best materials that we have, and built in our New York factory the same way every other Steinway piano is made.
These GI pianos were also built to survive being parachuted from high above the battlefield.
The pianos could be packed very, very tightly so that they could be delivered in whatever way they needed to be.
They earned the nickname Victory Verticals.
I think Steinway just really felt, as they were building these pianos, for victory, because they were going to play a role in the victory over the evil that World War II really was.
The differences between this and the Victory Vertical or GI piano. So you'll notice it's obviously a lot bigger. This is our larger upright, the K52. You'll notice there's legs, these front legs. These were not on the Victory Vertical. Why? Because, you know, when you're dropping it by parachute, moving it around the battlefield, these are fairly fragile, you know, and could easily break.
40 inches tall and light and camouflaged with 3 coats of olive green paint, the pianos were ready for the battlefield by June of 1942.
A lot of these pianos were shipped on the Flying Fortresses, and then they were parachuted over enemy lines and dropped down. They were also on trucks. We brought them all over the world to the war effort in Europe, the theater in the Pacific, also used at army bases. They were even on submarines. They have to be fastened very, very, very carefully. So in the case of the submarine, it's up against the wall and it's fastened very sturdily. So obviously going up and down and left and right, the piano doesn't roll around or move.
Once they left the factory, despite the best laid plans, there was no telling where the pianos might actually end up.
Once they were dropped down, sometimes they were in the middle of a field or a forest. We have pictures of these pianos in all sorts of places, not, in an officer's club, but literally like in a field, probably somewhere in France or in Germany, being used with rifles and helmets on top of them.
No matter where they were, they all served one important purpose: to boost morale and bring much-needed relief, even for just a short moment, to American men on the battlefield. And that's what they did, from the European theater to the Philippines. As American music filled the air, there was a small comfort for many. And with the familiar tunes came an image you rarely see: smiles amid the destruction of World War II.
They're sitting around a piano in a field somewhere in Europe. They're smoking cigarettes, they have their helmets on, and they're genuinely looking happy.
Music was such an important part of the war effort that if people were coming together, you must be able to sing our Star-Spangled Banner. We know that the pianos were delivered with sheet music,
Gershwin and Rodgers and Hammerstein and Rodgers and Hart.
patriotic songs, light classics, hymns, and the popular music of the day. There would be a time when the playing and singing of hymns would be very appropriate and needed. There would be a time when, if you've got a soldier who can sit down and play some boogie woogie, or just where they can just relax and sing and dance and enjoy. Music was important in World War II, that this is not just a military war, but it was a war of ideas and a war of cultures. And so it was very important to tell our story and support and build our culture as we are fighting our enemy.
Although their role was to support the men on the battlefield, that wasn't the only place you would find victory verticals. They were also occasionally accompanied by a Hollywood icon on a USO tour.
People like Bob Hope and Marlene Dietrich sang around these pianos.
There was a concert series in Northern Africa where the Victory Vertical was the star of the show. On a Bob Hope USO tour, he described that Frances Langford got the biggest laugh he'd ever heard when she stepped up to the mic and said, "I'm going to sing I'm in the Mood for Love."
I wish that I could kiss each and every one of you.
And one of the soldiers stood up and said, "You've come to the right place, honey."
But it wasn't just the big stage where victory verticals brought a smile to soldiers' faces.
They were used for groups as large as 15,000, hospital performances for one patient, and everything in between.
It really made them feel like they were back home again with family and friends, celebrating and just singing and feeling normal again.
The rare moment of joy meant so much that some men even wrote home to tell their family about it.
The mother who received it from her son, Kenneth Cranes, who described the piano being delivered to their unit. This was in the European theater, and he just describes to his mother what a wonderful time they had and how he went to sleep that night with tunes going through his head, and he was sort of describing a really good day on the battlefield. And she wanted Steinway to have a copy of this letter because her son was killed by German tank fire about 1 week later.
As the Steinway factory in the U.S. continued to ship out thousands of pianos across the globe, its sister factory in Hamburg, Germany, had a much different role.
During the war, the Hamburg factory was nationalized by Hitler, and just like in America, they stopped building pianos and started building for the Reich.
Our German factory in Hamburg made parts for artillery shells and the war effort at that time.
Against the wishes of the Steinway family, their factory was now working for the enemy, and it wasn't just making weapons.
One of the things they built was wooden swastikas, but also they're playing their part in the munitions industry. And as this got out, the American Steinways just felt a great need to separate themselves from the enemy.
An advertising campaign was soon launched, letting the public know that Steinway unequivocally stood with the U.S.
There were advertisements that the Steinway piano flew on the Flying Fortress. So that was very, very, prideful, but great marketing at the same time.
There were some cards stacked against Steinway just because it's a very German name, and there was an assumption in the United States that they would be pro-Nazi.
That couldn't be further from the truth, and Theodore Steinway hoped the advertising campaign would prove that. Remember, he had 4 sons serving in the U.S. military, along with his nephews. His heart was with the American cause. By the summer of 1945, the tide of the war had changed, and the Allies soon declared victory.
The victory in Europe and rejoicing all over the world is the greater because of the recollection of the triumph of Nazi barbarism and its final overthrow.
As American men returned home, not all of the victory verticals came with them.
In some cases, were just abandoned on the battlefield. The first reason for that is because when they were delivered to the troops, it was with the caveat that don't think you have to bring this back when you're finished with it. That would be very difficult. And so they said, when you're done, this is a disposable piece of equipment. You can abandon it, burn it, bury it, whatever you need to do.
One that met an untimely fate was so important to the men it helped entertain that they recommended it receive a prestigious award.
There was a piano in the Pacific Theater that was bombed and, to the point where it could not be used again. And the unit that actually had named her, Janie, sent a request that she be awarded a Silver Star for her action.
We don't have any information on actually how many survived, but we did receive, like the one we have here at our factory, we do still have a few available. A few are in museums, and a few are still on military bases, so there are a handful still surviving.
One belongs to Gary Peterson, who is a Steinway artist. His victory vertical came from Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. After the war, it was considered surplus, and a soldier loaded it up and took it home, where it was painted and used by his aunt. Decades later, it ended up with Gary, who restored it to its original glory. The boxy, drab green pianos serve as a reminder of the difficult days of World War II, but also of the power music has to bring people together, something which makes the Steinway family very proud.
I had numerous connections with Steinway in 2007 and 2008 and had an opportunity to play a recital at Steinway Hall, and I had the opportunity to sit down with Henry Steinway. Mr. Steinway had just come from receiving a National Medal of Honor at the White House for his contribution to our country.
The 2007 National Medal of Arts to Henry Z. Steinway.
And one of the questions I asked him was, what's something that you're really proud of that I might not know? And he said, well, let me tell you about the Victory vertical pianos from World War II.
As Mr. Steinway described his company's contribution to the war effort, Peterson was blown away.
First of all, I was ashamed because I thought, I should know this. I have a doctorate in piano. I should know everything there is to know about piano and piano music. But I discovered that many of my colleagues also did not know about this important piece of history.
He knew Americans needed to hear the fascinating story. Peterson now travels the country telling the forgotten story of the Victory Vertical that means so much to the Steinway family.
We've been manufacturing pianos in America for 170 years. I think it's with great pride that we're able to do our share and do our part during a very important and pivotal part of American history. And we are just very proud to be an American company.
I would hope that when you see or hear about this story or see one of these pianos, you would remember that music making especially is an important way to tell our story and to lift our spirits and to be in community and to build a culture that is worth fighting for.
Steinway briefly decommissioned the Victory Vertical after World War II and then brought them back into production during the Korean War. Coming up on our next episode, under the cover of darkness, Nazi saboteurs land on American shores. Their mission? Wreak havoc across the country.